Hello Proponomics people, and welcome to a special edition of the Macro Blast, which is from the 2nd of February 2024, Friday. So why is it a special edition? Well, because yesterday was the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee meeting. Now, for those who don't know, these are the people that set the interest rate. And I say people quite deliberately, there are 9 of them. Now, we often only hear the bank has, obviously recently, raised rates. Although since September, held rates. We don't really hear too much more detail than that. But I think the detail's really important, and I know for sure that the bond markets look at the detail. And ultimately, that's what we're most interested in. Why are we interested in the bond markets? Because they are going to set the rates of the mortgages that we're going to pay. So yesterday, it was very widely expected that the bank would hold the rates, but the information is in the correct score market, if you will, if you call it in football betting. How did the committee vote? So firstly, a little bit on the committee itself and who it's made up of. So there is the chairman or chairperson, that is Andrew Bailey at the moment, and he is in post until 2028. And then there is the deputy governor who sits below Mr. Bailey. So Mr. Bailey is the governor of the bank as well as the chairman of that committee, of course. And he also chairs the other committee, the Financial Policy Committee, which meets a couple of times a year. Then you have some pretty eminent economists and some big players from the rest of the bank, including the bank's chief economist, of course. But you have 4 external parties, and then you have the 5 internalists who all won't necessarily agree anyway. It really isn't a room of yes people agreeing with each other. And of course, they put really significant thought and scrutiny into, frankly, getting the best people in the world that they can, or the best people in the world that they think are there for that post anyway, into those positions. And there's been some chatter, some of the more out there thoughts in the past 12 months have included that Joe Rogan should be the chair of the Federal Reserve because he has a very good questioning nature about him. Of course, he's not an economist, and it would be fairly dangerous to see what Joe might decide to do. But of course, he would only be one person on a committee, even if he was the chair. So just like if you have a pretty crazy person as president, mentioning no particular names, it doesn't mean that all this crazy stuff necessarily goes on, because of course there are robust checks and balances in place. And this is one of the reasons why it was so important to make the Bank of England independent, apart from anything else. But I digress. So there are these 4 external players on the committee. So to learn about yesterday's vote and the way it went, which was 6 people voting to hold the rates at 5.25, 2 people voting to put the rates up to 5.5, and 1 person voting to put the rates down to 5. And that's quite interesting. And also, I don't really believe that internally the bank really love that position and that message that it sends out to the world. Because actually 0.5%, the difference between the top and the bottom in terms of the people on the committee there, is a big differential. And the underlying message behind all of that is, do they really know what they're doing? And I think that's part of the story really that they won't like. But we go back to the previous meeting, which was the middle of December 2023, when the vote was 6 people to hold the rate at 5.25 and 3 people to raise it. So if you think about it from that perspective, then what we've ultimately had in yesterday's meeting is we've had 1 person drop from the 5.5 camp to the 5.25 camp. That is Megan Green, who's one of the externals. She is a preeminent economist, as all of the externals are. Incredible CV, Princeton, Harvard, Oxford University, etc., etc. She's relatively new to the Monetary Policy Committee. She only joined in July last year. So we haven't had too much time to see lots from her yet and really understand whether she's what we call a hawk or a dove. So the hawks are the people who always want to keep the rates as high as possible. They believe in high rates to control inflation apart from anything else. And at their core, they will look at the fact that inflation is still 4% CPI and core inflation is still 5% or so. Even though if we looked at the last 6 months core inflation, we would be about 3%. Now, either way, all of those are above the governmental target, and they take their job really seriously. That target is set by the government of 2%. I've talked before in other videos how I believe that secretly the government and the Treasury really rub their hands when the inflation rate is between 3 and 4%, especially when they're in a situation like they are at the moment, when they've already frozen the tax thresholds and nobody is really getting too worked up about it. Because I'm afraid to say the general public don't understand the carbon monoxide nature of inflation. And it's been said that 4 million more workers will be in the 40% higher rate tax bracket by 2029 if those thresholds get frozen. Now, I think there'll be some pressure to unfreeze some of those thresholds, but actually politically, it really hasn't been that unpopular to do that. And that's because I think people largely, unfortunately for them, don't understand it. Also, of course, still the majority are either on benefits under the under the personal allowance threshold or under the higher rate tax threshold anyway. So the majority aren't going to feel sorry for the people who are in the 40% bracket. But I think if we did hold till 2029, you'd be really, really surprised about some of the people who've got dragged into that higher rate bracket because they really won't have jobs that you would expect to be in the higher rate bracket. It's just inflation running away with them. But anyway, so we've had Megan Green move down from the 5.5 camp to the 5.25. She's left the Hawks for the moment, and she's joined the middle of the roaders. And then we've got Swati Dhingra, who's also an external member, who is a renowned dove of an economist. She thinks rates should be lower. She thinks we've done enough. She was regularly voting not to put the rate up as the rates were climbing throughout 2022 and 2023, but got dragged along. The other dove left the committee, and actually Megan Green joined. So we lost the dove and we got a half hawk by the looks of it at the moment. And that's another reason why getting into this level of detail is what gives me the confidence to predict that rates are going to stay higher for longer. And I said only just over a month ago, there was a 50-50 bet available at the time that the bank would drop the rates in March. And I thought that was ridiculous. It's one of the best value bets I've ever seen in my life, because I just saw there was less than a 5% chance of it happening, and you were getting a 50% payoff if you had placed a wager on that, which you can do through a number of different financial instruments. I am not soliciting people to start gambling on the interest rate, by the way. I don't do it myself, so I should make that very clear. But it was very clear in my mind that that just wasn't going to happen. And I did say the first thing you would need is a meeting, the meeting we've just had yesterday, where everybody voted at least to hold the rate. If not, Dhingra and maybe one or two others had voted to drop the rate. So until that meeting has happened, there won't be a cut at the next meeting, unless there's a really significant event, a real crisis event like a referendum where the result is unexpected, for example, or a war. And of course, unfortunately, the latter is more likely than anyone would like it to be at the moment. But that's the sort of crisis event we would be talking about that would make, and they would probably not wait for the next meeting. In those situations, they would call a meeting immediately, an emergency meeting of the Monetary Policy Committee, and they would just drop the rate there and then. So yesterday's message is very much rates are staying higher for longer. But if you spoke to the two people who were still voting to put the rate up, which is Jonathan Haskell and Catherine Mann, pretty relentless hawk, really, and Haskell's not far off that, they would say to you, well, actually, if we'd increased the rates in September, and the vote in the September meeting was 5-4 in favour of holding at 5.25, so it was very, very close. The other four wanted to put the rate up. The moral of the story is, had you put the rate up to 5.5, we could start dropping quicker than by holding the rate at 5.25. So the logic would be, perhaps we could have had 6 months at 5.5 and then started cutting slowly and gradually, rather than having 12 months at 5.25, which is probably where we've actually got to. And that's why I was a proponent of the September meeting. I would have been with the Hawks and put the rate up at 5.5, and it'd be interesting to see how that would go. Obviously, these things have a determinal causal runoff, so we don't know what would happen now if rates were 5.5, and we don't know if something else would have particularly gone wrong. But the next important thing really is the bond market's reaction to all of this. So the bond market's reacted quite strangely. First of all, the bond yields raised, so the bond prices fell, which means the yields come up. And that's because the message that was being given to the markets was higher for longer, higher for longer. But actually, we're talking about the 5-year bond yield, because that's the bond yield of our level of interest as borrowers, as mortgage takers who are probably going to use 5-year fixes for any debt that we're taking on. And ultimately, what happened was that the yields then started to drop. The bond prices came upwards. So the bonds actually finished the day about 20 basis points lower than they started this week. So it's a fairly significant shift downwards. And that's opposite to what the market would expect. But why would that happen? Well, it's simply because what the market's saying is, by holding the rates higher, it does mean that over the 5-year period that's being considered, the overall rate can actually come down. And I actually think that's the correct logic. So I hope that makes sense and it's useful and tells you a bit more about the inner workings of the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee.